Let's pick up where we left off with phylogenetic trees. We had said that in the phylogenetic trees we'd been looking at so far, and in many of them, the length of the tree's branches don't necessarily indicate any degree of evolutionary change or any particular time frame. The chronology represented by the branching pattern of the tree is relative. In other words, it just tells you this comes after this, or this comes before this, or this comes earlier or later. It's not absolute. It doesn't tell you this occurred 200 million years ago or 50 million years ago or anything like that. But in some cases, in some trees, the length of the branch can reflect the number of genetic changes that have taken place in that particular DNA sequence, and in some cases we even tie it to particular time frames as well, but that would need to be noted at some point for that to be the case. In this example, the length of the branch on this phylogenetic tree reflects the number of changes that have taken place in a particular DNA sequence in that lineage. So for example, if we were looking at one particular sequence of DNA and comparing that sequence amongst all of these various species, well, the branches here, we're using that to indicate the amount of change that has occurred in that particular sequence. So with this long line here, the longer line going out to the fruit fly, as opposed to, say, the shorter lines going out to the human or the mouse, this implies that the time since the mouse and the fly diverged from a common ancestor, more genetic changes have occurred in the fruit fly, the Drosophila lineage, than in the mouse lineage. So in some cases, the length of the branch or the length of the line is supposed to be indicative of an amount of genetic change or some particular amount of time, but that would need to be noted. Otherwise, you would simply use the branches as an indicator of an evolutionary relationship. But like in this case, they're noting that it does represent that, so you can take that for a fact. In this example, we are tying an actual time frame to the phylogenetic tree. So at this point, the branch can represent chronological time, and the branching points can be determined from the fossil record. So we can actually look back if we add this time frame along the bottom, and we would say the point at which the lineage that went from the common ancestor to the chicken that also led to the mammals, the human and the mouse, was sometime in the Paleozoic, X many millions of years ago. And then if we wanted to know where is the common ancestor for all of these creatures, at what point did that common ancestor live, well, you would have to travel all the way back to the pre-Paleozoic time frame. So if there is a time frame associated with the phylogenetic tree, it's going to have to be noted, and that phylogenetic tree, the links of the lines are going to have to correspond to that time frame. So in many cases this is not true, but like in this particular case, in this phylogenetic tree, the branch links are proportional to time. Another question that scientists face when they're trying to create these phylogenies and these taxonomic divisions and trying to make all these trees and groupings is they have to decide what is the best way to show this, or what is the most likely way that this occurs, because there can be so many combinations. Let's say you're analyzing data for approximately 50 species. Well, that means there are 3 times 10 to the 76 different ways to arrange those 50 species into a tree. How can you possibly decide which one of those tree-shaped mechanisms is going to be most reflective of reality? Which tree in this huge forest reflects the true phylogeny, the true evolutionary pattern? Well, systematists can never be sure of finding the best tree in a large data set. That's a problem, of course. We can't say for sure 100% that this is the way that it is, especially if we're looking at large sets of data, huge numbers of species, and massive amounts of time. Most scientists are very good about never declaring certainty. That's not really the scientific method. The scientific method is primarily dealing in percentages and likelihoods, and so you would say that this is, based on the evidence, the most likely scenario. And if our evidence changes, the scenario possibly changes. So recall that biology gray area that I and Hank Green keep talking about that so many people sometimes find uncomfortable. Well, this is a good example. When you're analyzing all of this data and trying to find the best fit, the best pattern, there's a couple of rules you would likely follow to hopefully get you what is going to be most likely the most logical scenario. They narrow the possibilities by applying the principles of maximum parsimony and maximum likelihood. So these two terms we're going to take a look at, maximum parsimony and maximum likelihood, because these are terms that scientists use not only in this portion of biology, but in many other ways in the realms of science. They kind of follow these two rules. The first term, maximum parsimony, assumes that the tree that requires the fewest evolutionary appearances of shared derived characters, is the most likely. This kind of relates back to this idea of Occam's razor. We should first investigate the simplest explanation that is consistent with the facts, and this is known in science and actually in more than just science, but throughout the world, as Occam's razor, named after the William of Occam, a 14th century English philosopher who advocated this minimalist problem-solving approach, this way of shaving away unnecessary complications. In layman's terms, you might say the simplest explanation is usually the best, and in science that's oftentimes what we try to apply. The simplest explanation that is consistent with the facts is generally the one that you're going to find to be the most correct. So in creating a phylogenetic tree, you would want a tree that has the fewest evolutionary events, the fewest twists and turns and breaks and that type of thing. The second principle is the principle of maximum likelihood, and that one states that given certain rules about how DNA changes over time, a tree can be found that reflects the most likely sequence of evolutionary events. When we're creating these trees, there are certain assumptions that we have to make as far as how DNA acts and the time frame in which DNA changes, and so if we apply those rules, we can come up with a tree that would or should reflect the most likely sequence of evolutionary events. So we try to make it as clear and simple as possible, and we try to create a tree that, following the rules that we're going to use, is most likely to be correct. Now that doesn't mean that a second person might look at this slightly differently and use slightly different assumptions and come out with a slightly different tree. That's likely, especially if you're looking at huge amounts of data and huge number of species over long periods of time. But you're not going to get variations that are so far off that statistically they don't match up to some degree. In the example they show in the book, like when they're comparing again the human and the fungi, the mushroom and the tulip, there's a couple of different ways that we could show this branching, and both of them might be possible, but the one that would be most likely would be tree number one that they show here, and that's based on the assumption that the genetic changes that occur in the DNA happen at a particular rate and at a steady rate over time, and so that would be indicated by tree number one, whereas tree number two would be less likely, because for this to be correct you would have to have instead of a steady rate of change in the DNA or the changes in the genetic code, you would have to have a rate that speeds up and slows down at other times, and that's less likely. So using the particular rules that we choose, the assumptions that we need to follow, tree number one becomes the more likely phylogenetic tree that more likely represents reality. Going back to what we were saying earlier, especially when you're looking at molecular data and genetic data, it's really not possible without the use of computers and mathematical programs. So computer programs are used to search for trees that are both parsimonious and likely, and this is going to give us the best results according to the data that we enter. And of course these models are based on assumptions made with available evidence. If we learn of new evidence or information, we adjust our models, we adjust our assumptions to hopefully best reflect reality, and that's really what science is all about. If you are looking for absolutes, science is really not the place to find that, because science is all about finding the evidence that supports a particular hypothesis until you find evidence otherwise. You are always basically trying to negate your hypothesis. You're trying to look for the negative that upends your hypothesis, and if you do, of course, you can strike that out and try again. But if you accumulate evidence that continually supports that hypothesis, you feel stronger about it, but rarely would you ever say that you are 100% sure and that this is never going to change. That's really just not the mode of science. That's not the way to think scientifically. So the same thing happens here. We base these models on certain assumptions, and then we use those models to provide us the best look of reality as far as we know it to be. Earlier I talked about how phylogenetic trees are simply another form of a hypothesis that can be tested, and the best hypotheses for phylogenetic trees fit the most data. So if your hypotheses or your hypothesis for a particular phylogenetic tree fits the majority of the data, you can feel more confident, and that would be the morphological, the molecular, and the fossil data. Thinking of phylogenies as hypotheses also allows us to use them in a powerful way. We can make and test predictions based on the assumption that a phylogeny, our hypothesis, is correct. So we can test to see if it might be correct, and we can go out to the real world and look for fossils or look for molecular data to see if our phylogenetic tree, if our ideas are supported or if they are not. There's something called phylogenetic bracketing, which allows us to predict features of an ancestor from features of its descendants. So we know, for example, that birds are descendants of dinosaurs. Well, we can look at some of the features of current birds, and we can extrapolate backwards in a way to see and to think, did the dinosaurs have a lot of the same features? Were those features present in birds today because they were present in an ancient ancestor that also parted off and became the dinosaurs? So that would allow us to infer characteristics of creatures that are no longer around based on the characteristics of their current descendants. So if we look at this example of a phylogenetic tree, we already talked about the fact that crocodiles and birds are more closely related than crocodiles are to lizards and snakes. And you can see the branching point where the common ancestor of all crocodilians and dinosaurs and birds is right at this point. So we know that crocodilians are still around, and certainly birds are still around. Well, what characteristics or what traits or what genetic data do the crocodiles and the birds share that perhaps the dinosaurs that are no longer around would have also shared? Because if the crocodiles and the birds share certain traits or characteristics, well, then that likely came from the common ancestor. And if it was present in that common ancestor, well, then it would have also been present in the dinosaurs that are represented here that are no longer around. Believe it or not, birds and crocodiles kind of share several features in common. They have four-chambered hearts. They sing songs to defend their territory and attract mates. Of course, in a crocodile or an alligator, it's more of a bellow than a pretty mockingbird song, but still it's the same thing. They both are nest builders. They both are brooders. In other words, they sit on their eggs to keep their eggs warm until their eggs hatch. So they have all these characteristics in common, and you would think if a bird and a crocodile have these characteristics in common, it was likely because those characteristics were present in their common ancestor. And if that was the case, well, then they should have been present in the other species from that common ancestor that are no longer around. So you would expect to also find that in all of the descendants of that common ancestor, including the dinosaurs. And sure enough, that is something that can be tested. We can look and see, do we find any fossil evidence that might back that up, or is that just an idea that we can't seem to find any evidence for? Well, the fossil record supports the idea that dinosaurs were nest builders and that they would brood their eggs, that they would sit on their eggs and guard their nests. We have multiple fossil finds where we find the fossilized remains of adult dinosaurs on top of nests of eggs, and sometimes even within the eggs we find the fossilized remains of the dinosaur embryos. So that would be a prediction that was made by the phylogenetic tree that has been borne out by evidence that we have found in the field. Let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we're going to go to Concept 26.4. That is all about the genetic side of this and documenting these evolutionary changes within the molecular, the genome portion of that. And of course, that's something that we couldn't even do 50 years ago. It would have been unbelievable to the likes of Darwin or Linnaeus or all the older scientists to know the power that we have today to detect some of these evolutionary pathways. So we'll come back in just a second, Concept 26.4, and take a look at that.